Today I'm here with Daryl, the curator of the Cumberland County Museum here in Cumberland County, Nova Scotia. And I have to say, I love this house. I really do, because I love old things because I'm old, right? And because I work at a national park, I'm familiar with some of the items in here, but perhaps you can give me a little bit of background as to who built the house, who lived in this house, and then eventually how it became a museum.
Certainly. So this house was built about 1840. It was built by Robert Dickey, who was one of the four fathers of Confederation that were born in Amherst.
When visitors come to this wonderful old house, what can they expect to see? What type of exhibits are available for public viewing?
You can expect to see exhibits and artifacts dealing with some of the history of Cumberland County overall. Amherst had the name Busy Amherst in the years following Confederation. The railway made this area kind of the hub for collecting everything from Nova Scotia and transporting it on to the areas of Upper and Lower Canada, or Ontario and Quebec. And because of that, companies decided, well, why do we have to transport goods from elsewhere when we can set up our company right here at this nexus point? And so we do speak to that part of our history quite a bit. We do speak as well to the idea that there are four fathers of Confederation who were born in this area. To me, that's a wonderful question to ask. Well, what is it about this area? What were the people's beliefs or thoughts at that time that there would be four people who would be part of the creation of a nation from this area? What was going on in their families? What was the discussion like? Why was Charles Tupper, for example, who became prime minister, why was he so determined in the face of the fact that most of the province at that time was opposed to the idea of Confederation? And yet he won. He carried the day. These things are part of the discussion that we have here now, and what we're going to really develop over the next little while.
I would imagine that at that time, the debate, even among families, must have been bitter, because there must have been a lot of people that were thinking, why do we want to join these other provinces? Mm-hmm. And there must have also been pressure from certain groups to join the United States, because if you think about it logically, where we were situated geographically, it makes more sense to trade north and south than it does east and west.
Mm-hmm. There were a lot of discussions, and healthy discussions that happened.
Oh, come on, this is Nova Scotia. Come on.
Yes, it's part of the Blue Nose way to talk about these things.
Well, you've been in legions and places when political discussions come on. They don't tend to be, I would say civil, but they tend to get a little heated at times.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I could well imagine that the discussion about joining Confederation, which is a relatively new process, mm-hmm. and then the pressures that some of these debates in the 19th century, it wouldn't take much to people to get angry, would it?
I don't think that it did. In fact, we can see in newspapers that some of these political discussions ended up in fistfights.
And it sounds like any legion in Nova Scotia.
You had people here who came from the States. They were not necessarily United Empire Loyalists to begin with. They came to this area because there was free land that was being offered.
Were they part of the planters that replaced the Acadians?
Yes, yeah. So the planters group were not philosophically opposed to becoming their own country in the United States. It's just that they didn't have the possibility of acquiring land there anymore. And so they came to a place where that land was available. So you had that underlying current of thought. Then you had people from Yorkshire who were very much tied to Great Britain. But you had people that were still trying to tease the United States into this area. And there was a rebellion that happened that was eventually quelled by people here at Amherst.
Here in Nova Scotia, there was a rebellion?
Yeah. At one time, there was talk about this being the 14th colony. and so that's pretty strong thought.
Yes, and
that
opposing views. You wouldn't sit down and have a cup of tea, would you?
No. The whole story of how people discussed and the interactions between nations in the 1700s and 1800s. It really plays out here. You had just a few kilometers away, this would have been Britain, but a few kilometers away was France. You have two forts kind of across from each other on the Tantramar Marsh, looking at each other kind of in a little bit of détente. Who's going to fire first? Who's going to break this Cold War between nations? And then you've got the United States entering into the fray as well. These forces existed. And I think they still exist to some degree because people bring their history forward with them to today. And out of all of this, you had people, for example, Dickey, who built this house, was opposed to Confederation with Ontario and Quebec. He didn't think it was a good idea.
Well, he's sort of got a point, doesn't he?
Yeah. He thought the industrial areas would eventually supersede Nova Scotia. And it was only when there was financial considerations given to Nova Scotia that he finally relented and said, okay. Through all of these heated discussions and debates, to me, it's important for us to realize that there's an ongoing civility. We're trying to become more, despite our differences.
We're becoming Canadians.
Yes, yeah, and so when you've got that kind of discussion going on, we can learn from that with all of the divisiveness politically that's going on today.
We're back with Daryl, the curator of the Cumberland County Museum, and we're in this room with all these wonderful artifacts. Now, some of them I'm familiar with. For example, I learned how to type on a typewriter, something like this, but it wasn't that old because I'm not that old. But I think we're going to have a little chat about Sir Charles Tupper, a prominent Nova Scotian and a prime minister of our wonderful country.
Yes, a short-lived prime minister, but he was prime minister.
There were other ones that were shorter-lived than him. We won't get into that, but there were.
Yes.
Right?
One of the things about Charles Tupper is, of course, he was born here in Amherst, and he became a doctor. He studied in Edinburgh, and one of the things that he was very concerned about as he went around the around Cumberland County. He would ride on horseback to his to his calls that he had to make, and people would say that they knew that Charles Tupper was on his rounds because there would be a strange horse in their barn, and he would take somebody's horse and go on to the next
fresh horse.
A fresh horse.
So he had to be a really rare thing, a doctor that made house calls.
Yes,
right?
yeah, yes. And he recognized that there was a lot of poverty in the area, and on top of the poverty, or kind of leading up to the poverty, people were not necessarily literate. And in 1864, when he was elected as Premier of Nova Scotia, one of his primary pieces of legislation was to offer free education to the people of Nova Scotia and to the children, so literacy could be improved. And he saw this as a way of improving overall health, because now people could study for themselves, they could take care of themselves. And that underlying belief that people could forge their own destiny really informed his reasons for wanting to help build Confederation, that if there were better markets for your goods, you're also taking care of yourself. You're using that education that you received for the betterment of the community as a whole. And so we're very fortunate to have Charles Tupper's desk here. For when he was a doctor in town, he not only was the doctor, but he also owned the pharmacy, which still exists in the downtown core. So he would go to go to a location, prescribe medication, and then people would have to have that filled at his pharmacy here. But he was a very learned man, trying to do what was best for the people that he saw on a daily basis. And a lot of it came from how he had to deal with the medical needs of the community.
Now, that would have been a relatively rare thing in the middle of the 19th century to have mass public education.
It was.
Usually it was strictly for the upper classes.
Yeah, it was extremely rare. In fact, it was so rare that Nova Scotia was the first principality within the British Empire to offer free education to its people, which is an amazing piece of foresight that he had to bring that in and to encourage people to be responsible for your own development. And it comes from the fact that he was raised in a religion and in a faith community that was very Protestant in its outlook, and that people could pull themselves up by their own bootstraps.
Did he get any resistance? Because, a century prior to that, education was the purview of the upper classes because they viewed it as a lever of control. Mm-hmm. Right? So did he get any resistance from, I imagine that here at that time, that there would have been an upper class and a growing middle class, but was there any resistance?
It was more from some of the nobility and people that were already privileged in the area, that they didn't necessarily want to see some of this, but they could also see that there was a burden on the community as a whole. There were a lot of poorhouses in Nova Scotia.
Really, I thought that was an English or a European phenomenon. I didn't realize that they had them here.
Yes, in fact, there were whole communities that were poor communities near Antigonish. There was a community that was poor land, and people there were kind of on their at the point of needing to be in a welfare state. And so you had people who were responsible for administering funds to those that were in need. And that happened throughout Nova Scotia. And this was just his way of trying to deal with that.
I wonder with his education in Edinburgh, because at one time the Scots, particularly in Edinburgh, were the light of the Enlightenment. So I wonder how much he was colored by Scottish philosophers like Hume and Locke.
I have no doubt, that he really latched onto a lot of those philosophical beliefs. Most of the physicians at that time were either schooled in Boston or in Edinburgh. And those that were in Edinburgh were very proud of the fact that they were schooled there. In fact, letters that he signs, he says that he's an MD, and afterwards he says EDIN, period, meaning that he's from Edinburgh.
I'm back with Daryl from the Cumberland County Museum, and we're in a room with some very interesting exhibits, particularly one of an individual who was here in the early part of the 20th century that has historical significance.
Deep historical significance. Yeah, this room is all about different aspects of war that took place from the times of the Acadians through to the end of World War I. And one thing that people don't necessarily realize is that during the First World War, one of the largest internment camps of Canada was here. And one of the most famous individuals that was here was Leon Trotsky. And we don't necessarily think of Trotsky as being or having anything to do with Canadian history, but he did kind of shape things prior to going back to Russia and being involved in the Russian Revolution, and for a while being the right-hand man of Lenin and so forth. He was in New York for a period of time, trying to incite revolution from within the United States. And he had a moderate amount of success there, but he began to hear the drums of war and change happening in Russia, and he wanted to get back to that. So he got on a passage ship that would take him to Britain, and from there he could get back to Russia. Well, it just so happens that the ship was captured, and he was interned here for a period of time. And while he was here, he didn't let his oratory skills go to waste. He spent almost every day from sunup to sundown preaching his brand of communism and preaching about how to overtake the rich and the wealthy, and incited the workforce in the area, and that had repercussions throughout Nova Scotia at that time, where eventually there were rebellions that took place within Nova Scotia, and unionization led to many of the manufacturers locally choosing to relocate to other centers in Montreal and Ontario.
He must have been quite an orator, and what surprises me too is that he spoke English.
He was very learned. Not only did he speak English and Russian, but he was raised German, and he spoke Yiddish as well. and all of these different languages he was conversant in, which in part made him so effective that he could go between groups and be part of the group, because you could receive the message in whatever language he used at the time.
Well, I would imagine that the Canadian government wanted to get shuck of him as quick as they could.
He was really creating a lot of problems within the camp. And so, yes, they did agree to get rid of him just because he was creating more problems within the camp than he would have if he was sent away. And
That was a mistake, wasn't it?
well, to some degree it was. I mean, he was then part of the 1917 revolution in Russia and changed the course of history by the teachings that he put forward. Not only was he here, but we did have a number of captured German soldiers who were brought to this camp as well. And one of the things that they did was they carved toys for the local children, and they would go to the edge of the internment camp and pass these toys that they had made from scrap lumber to some of the local children for them to enjoy.
Well, the Germans have had a reputation for centuries of being some of the best toy makers in the world. Mm-hmm. And these are beautiful models, right?
Yes, all dealing with artillery and war.
It didn't end well for Trotsky, did it?
It did not. It did not. Eventually, he got on the wrong side of Stalin, and he escaped. Ended up in hiding in Mexico, and he was found by the Russian secret police and was assassinated there.
But he wasn't so quiet. He was writing books and articles criticizing Stalin. Right? Mm-hmm. And in my experience, you might be a little leery of poking a monster, right?
It's always wise to be careful how much you poke a bear.
Exactly. Right? And he was the first head of the Red Army. I do know something about his background. Like you say, he was a brilliant man and part of the intellectual wing that would have surrounded Lenin, him and Kamenev and Bukharin. Right? Mm-hmm. But he made the fatal mistake of insulting Stalin, and Stalin didn't forget this.
No.
So maybe he would have lived if he would have been quiet, but from what you tell me in preaching in the camps here, that wasn't his way.
Yeah, I think that what he saw in Stalin was that he was going too far. He was becoming the very epitome of the leader of the Russian people. Like all that was wrong about what he saw wrong about the Tsars was also wrong with Stalin.
Yeah. Multiplied 10 times because this was a sociopath, a monster. Right? Mm-hmm. And of course, history has proven that, right? But still in all, considering his background and where he came from, he's one of the giants of history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Darryl, I want to thank you for a wonderful visit here at the Cumberland County Museum, and I highly recommend it, and I hope you get lots of visitors this summer.
We're looking forward to that. We will be open Monday to Saturday throughout the summer this year, and throughout the summer as well, we're planning on updating some of our exhibits, making sure that we are addressing all of the history of Cumberland County, including the African Nova Scotian history. The Mi'kmaq history needs a much more prominent position within our storylines. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunities that presents.